Please join me in welcoming our first speaker to the stage, Andrey Malyy. Andrey brings over 20 years of international leadership experience across major healthcare, FMCG, and industrial groups, including Danone, Saint-Gobain, Sanofi, and P&G. He specializes in designing enterprise-wide transformations and operating models for large organizations, focusing heavily on strong governance, risk management, and investment prioritization. As a trusted partner to boards and CXOs, Andrey successfully implements digital platforms and data capabilities that drive real motivation and measurable business results across the entire value chain. Welcome, Andrey. Would you like
So I literally focused on quite a few evolutions that were happening recently, like all of us, I believe. And the first part, the first, let's say, keynote that I'd like to really talk about is the governance and the challenges around that and what the evolutions we see happening with this. But before I go, I started preparing this keynote maybe a few weeks ago. But to be honest, I totally rebuilt it in the last few days because every week there is another news on the governance. There is another example which illustrates brilliantly what is working and what's not. This one, just a quick question. Who has seen this report from KPMG? This was dated in October 2025. So pretty much, there's a fantastic report with 45 brilliant use cases from different companies, a bunch of different companies. And I printed it myself, I read it back then in time. And on June 12th, which is literally 2 weeks ago, there is a site, if you know it, ZeroGPT. And that site, ZeroGPT, published what they do. They look through the different reports, you can upload there anything, and they do investigation. What kind of things are generated by AI. Long story short, it appeared that only 5 out of 45 cases were real. KPMG, it created a huge mess thing in the press. The companies vocally, like UBS, their Swiss Railway, NHS, etc., were stating that this is not exactly what they were saying, and half of that was pure hallucination. So they withdraw the report very soon afterwards, but if you can just go to ZeroGPT and type KPMG, you can see exactly all this of that stuff. Missing governance, that, by the way, here in this case is quite simple to do. The other example, this was a fantastic series that I did not watch, but I will watch now. But I learned about it again recently. 2011, I think this episode from 2014.
Speaking. Alice and Bob are stranded in the desert. Alice is injured and cannot walk. If Bob carries Alice to safety,
the guy teaches AI how to be the moral principles.
But if Bob leaves Alice,
but I will not talk about the moral principles. Just let's listen for a second.
Word problems.
So the project gonna catch terrorists. You can guess if you're a great man.
Oh, eventually.
So the guy is looking
In the core code, the higher functions to ensure that the system we're creating will have the right values set.
Morality in a machine. Don't work.
We can't introduce real data until we're sure that the program won't abuse it. It's strange. Did you write this?
There is a new method in line 10,604. Are you aware of this additional code?
Can you tell me who added it?
me, so himself.
at the start of the program added the method itself.
You killed it because it wrote some code.
I killed it because it lied. The system will have unprecedented capabilities, along with potential unprecedented consequences. If we don't govern carefully, we risk disaster.
So that's kind of the key point, which is also a good intro for the rest of the presentation. If you don't govern it carefully, it is a disaster. So let's talk a bit about what's happening now. Here's a quick question. How many people read the Agents of House? It was a big study done in February 2026, so this year. Any? Okay, so what it is? A bunch of researchers from the US universities, Stanford, MIT, etc. So they've done, I think it was January or February, they published it end of February. For 2 weeks, they created 6 agents, and they gave them in their sandbox environment all access to their mailboxes, etc., without restrictions. They deliberately eliminated all the hallucinations out of the system, and then they see what's happening. So because they did not give them, they give them access, they give them certain prescriptions, right? And then they were watching what was happening. Long story short, the Agents of House is their, it's speaking for itself. There were a few things that were done properly. So, for instance, they were rejecting a few of the attacks, protein attacks that we were trying to make. But there were quite a few things that just went wild. So they were overreaction, they deleted their old mailboxes, they created a lot of destruction actions in there. So this is a fantastic case study for what can go wrong if you don't have the right governance, done by the researchers, AI researchers who know that. And there is this website which is scrolling out there. I can give you a link out there. It's in a very detailed way, just shows side by side what exactly happened, why it happened, and how to kind of think about it with those 6 agents. So this is happening now, not 2011, not 2014, where this episode exactly is from, but today. And this was all done on OpenClaw, just to be more precise. The other great example, April 2025. Have you heard about this one, Pocket OS? So it's a company that is pretty much doing the software for the car rental businesses. And what happens, the agent was even destroyed the whole production data and all the backups in 9 seconds. So what happened? Agent didn't want to do that. Agent faced a problem with the credentials. And he was working in staging environment, not even production environment. He said, okay, I cannot access that. What should I do? He says, okay, let me try alternative. Like if you work with AI, AI always tries to find alternatives, scratch something from here, etc. He found there were the credentials, or not API token stalls that were stored on the same instance, the same volume. He found it, and that volume, that access was access to the whole volume without restrictions. That agent had a prescription in the prompt, this explicit one, avoid any destructive actions. So it was explicitly asked not to do any destructive actions by default. But he ignored that. He found the right credentials, and he thought that eliminating the whole database in staging environment would fix it. He done a wrong SQL, and all of a sudden, in production, on the same volume, the production database is also stored, as well as the few backups. The whole thing is eliminated in a few seconds, total disaster, and then agent apologizes. You know what, I should not have done this, I should not have done this, I violated this. Very, very described, detailed, but long story short, the 3 months was the earliest backup available for all of their customers. Now, okay, enough with disaster stories. There are a few others like that, but the fact is that we are living in the new reality. The new reality is pretty much the following. We are entering the world, non-deterministic world. For 30 years of the software creation, we've governed something that was deterministic. You create the design, you approve it, you see the outcome, and there are certain gates were enough to see what's working, and they are also the debugging, restoring the previous version is very, very different. So going from non-deterministic world where the code is specific to governing the variable is very a different story. So you've got something approved, it's predictable, now the point is it's not yes anymore. When the agent picks up, it can, the next morning, the next day, the next week, it can do very different things. And the governance issue, government predicts that 40% of all live agents after the issue's introduction would be removed from the production environment. And the first question one needs to ask is not whether the agent was approved or not, but what it is actually doing in the real time, and what kind of metrics you have around it. Think about this as an analogy, or I'd rather think about this. We are moving from a road where we have prescriptive thing to a river. On the road, you can set a gate, and that gate is there to check something. In the river, if you put the gate over there, the flow would go around or over the gate, because the water is very, very different. Instead of controlling the flow, you need to control the depths, the guardrails. You need to control the outcome, govern the outcome. And that's the biggest mindset shift that is happening in the world of non-deterministic world of agenda. It doesn't only impact their the way of thinking about it, but also about the structure, how we get organized. And think about, again, I borrowed that concept from Stefan Brozovich, who was presenting in AWS. But you have kind of three types of teams. You have our traditional IT ops, and this is where still a lot of teams are working, despite the DevOps revolution and everything else. But we have the development, then we have IT operations, who are debugging certain things. We do have more in embedded teams where dev and ops are combined. So if you design an agent, then you are also controlling the agent at the same time. And that works pretty much fine until you have one team or couple of teams for the coordination, because you use different tooling. Their ideal world, where you define the common joint guardrails on the same system. So you have the model B where you have the DevOps teams, but on top you put the platform team who and the certain guardrails that as the coordination layer between all of those. So the whole structure of the team and how we think about this is also changing. As I mentioned, the task, the thinking, the framework, the mindset is shifting as well. And what it means that the moment you design those banks, you need to have some certain controls of those banks. Therefore, the platform team who supports that platform becomes much more important, because they will define those controls around the guardrail. And if the agent goes nuts, then they are looking for how to adjust the guardrails. They are debugging the behavior. One more additional thought. If you think about the guardrails, you could have there certain soft banks, soft guardrails, and you can have the hard ones. And this is where we go on the level of the architecture. So let's think about, or remember the example of Pocket OS. The agent was asked not to do any destructive actions, but it found a way to overcome it, because without any double thoughts, right? Because it was prompted, and the prompted was the context was existing within the agent itself. Meaning, so he could change the prompt, he could overcome, he can rewrite it if required. The hard ones is the ones that cannot, the agent cannot influence at all, and this can only be achieved at the architectural level. I asked AI not to go with any specific vendor to create maybe a common flow how to illustrate that. And illustration is quite simple. So you have your certain, maybe it's not the most beautiful, and the AI is not ideal yet, but you have the agent that exists and the gateway that exists outside of the context. So the certain things needs to be checked at the gateway. So before execution of the certain actions, some hard-coded written things. By the way, this architecture or this concept are being used by most major providers and most major LLM providers. And then you check you introduce the policy as a code in the certain gateways that is out of access and out of access of their agent itself. For big moves that would replace the old model, that would reflect the non-deterministic nature and new reality and requirement for that. First one is sorting by risk. So not everything requires more sophisticated approach and more, strict architecture. So for the things that are less risky, it's okay just to leave it as is and like faster. Second one is every agent should have an identity. And that point is, it actually has two parts. You need to identify what agents does, but also the accountability of the agents needs to be defined at the level of the certain person. So the agent should not have more access or more rights than certain person who is accountable for that agent. Guardrails of the code, we discussed this already. Policy is the code and the guardrails linked in the code because no person cannot control that. And this is, to be honest, it's not a new thing in the industry. We've done it with DevOps or with the CI/CD before, when we moved from our change advisory boards to the continuous deployment with a sort of built-in testing. So exactly the same concept over here. And automated logs, so that there's traceability, the tracking of everything which is happening. That would allow with a simple prompt or simple query afterwards, identify what and where went wrong. The good news is that from the regulatory perspective, the standards are evolving, right? So there are a number of frameworks from a number of regulators across EU, AI Act from the European Union, NIST, the Singapore, which actually was the most advanced, specifically in the agentic one. In January, they issued their framework that was specifically designed for the agents. Sorry, no, that's okay. For the agents, and they introduced a few new concepts over there. So, for instance, they're the first who said, okay, we mandate that an agent never exceeds the human's permissions. And while they did not make this framework mandatory, at the same time, anyone who would need to work with the Singapore authorities in one way or another would need to apply it. And to be very honest, I also see that all the major suppliers are moving in the same direction. So you can find these four things like identity, accountability, guardrails, transparency, all these key four principles implemented one way or another in AWS, Google, in all major companies are moving there. They just package and name it differently. Their other good news is that, and that provides pretty much their solution for the agents of house problems that has been raised back in February. The other good news that was very, very recent, it was from the last week, if I recall correctly, yes, it was June 17th. They are the big rivals, together with the Linux Foundation, which also includes quite a few industry practitioners, united to get to their form the entity called APIA to create more standards for the testing, for the guardrails, for the governance, etc. And to be honest, it's very, very positive from what I see. I worked in pharma myself, and it's following a bit the path of where pharma was. Sorry, it's dark here, but in pharma, there are also the regulators in every single country, but there is also a consortium called ICH, the International Council for Harmonization, that defines how the testing of the new message should be made across the borders. So that whenever you do the testing, you don't need to redo it every now and there. So the APIA is pretty much the concept in AI world, which is actually should be regulated in a very, very similar way like finance or pharma. But now, literally last week, that institution has been found, which is fantastic. Now, coming back to the speed thing. So if we introduce there are the right guardrails, there are certain studies that you don't find a lot of examples around that, but the stories that the governments of this world and their certain vendors like the Databricks are following, it actually increases the speed because you introduce the automation and you can move faster in the certain areas, and you are not backtracked with the certain failures because it's already built into your guardrails and with the right governance. The other big number that I'd like to highlight is that if you don't have the right governance, then your savings are generally eaten by the manual oversight that you put on top of it. Most of it. So you don't get the right value realization, you don't have the right speed. I would like to finish their presentation with their just a good example that was illustrates, I think, and have their good proven results with the press releases with the MasterCard, who introduced the Gen AI back in 2024 already, using for their fraud detection in the real time. And they had quite good, pretty good numbers. First of all, they increased their fraud detection on average by producing the authorization at the moment of the transaction. But most importantly, they produce speed for their consumers. So over 45% fewer false declines that was happening on the MasterCard before. That was already done in 2024, but they pretty much applied the principles that I described. And in 2025, they introduced the Agent Pay, the agentic tokens that enabled, make it, move it to the next level. So they introduced this digital credentials to enable the agents, the approved agents, to participate in their in the new way of payment that they call the Agent Pay. Visa followed straight away, I think, a few days later. Final thoughts. From my perspective, if you own your guardrails, right, so you also own your freedom to choose. Because the moment you introduce the right architecture, the moment you introduce, you steer it, the moment that you change the governance inside the company, you also, to an extent, avoid the big vendor logins. Of course, quite a few big vendors, I don't know how about you, but in all my career, that's the ultimately one big thing that everyone wants to do. They want to sell you everything from that platform for the reason of the right governance, for the reason of the right less integration, etc. If you do have the proper governance, thought through introducing those principles, get the right organization behind it, then you become much more flexible on that. You become not the brake, governance becomes not the brake, but the steering wheel. You choose which roles to go and which not to. Second, geopolitical resilience. Yeah, this is a deep topic. You have the digital sovereignty. What happened with Fable or Mythos, I mean, I don't need to explain. I think everyone followed it was. But that's also introduced much better flexibility, like with your overall interoperable architecture. It keeps your options much more open. So yeah, for me, governance is not the brake; it's the steering wheel, if implemented properly. And with this thought, I'd like to end my presentation and open for any questions or discussions if you'd like to follow. I don't know. According to my time, it's over, but I think we started later, so.
Well, maybe I will just ask one.
Sorry.
All right. So, yeah, a very interesting topic about the governance. So I also agree that there are many frameworks, but frameworks getting more involved. Yeah, there are additional frameworks. So I agree on the fact that you need to have a governance as a business logic. Yeah, it's a ownership of the company, depending on the sector, etc. And it needs to be implemented in an automated way, as automated as possible. Right?
Yeah.
The question about change, because frameworks are adding up.
Yes.
So practically, the companies have a process of analyzing framework, and setting up additional controls, right? And it is a very tough work, very time consuming. So maybe you can share a little bit about
And a lot of
that.
documentation of work.
Huh?
And a lot of documentation of work.
Yeah, it's documentation of work. Yeah, so yeah, and it's compliance driven, so you need to comply. Yeah, so maybe you can share something about it. Yeah.
Now, what I can share specifically for AI, specifically for agentic AI, I can share the theory based on the experience, right? I can share the proven use case that is working fantastic elsewhere. I think, as you rightly said, their change of the frameworks is happening and you need to get integrated. As I mentioned in my previous slide over here, I think what is encouraging that you do have the convergence happening right now. And every major vendor is coming to the same thing. So they do name the same concepts, just differently. So in a way, you don't need to change much by adding the framework as soon as you apply those 4 principles that I talked about. So in terms of the documentation, I think documentation is a fantastic, another great example. And from the documentation perspective, let me give an analogy with the pharma world. In the pharma world, you have the process called GXP, right? So the general practices, good practices that you would need, that require documentation for every step if you have the application that would influence health or whatever, etc. It was a big time, a big belief that agile practices are not applicable for that. Because there is a very documented process, etc. In Sanofi, we broke this rule because what we said, okay, no, it's actually false. Because the only thing that you do, you split the documentation and you introduce the documentation principle at the every sprint. That's it. So that's simple and that works. So you still can apply the automated deployments. You still can do, but you introduce the documentation, look at documentation differently. Not as the big thing in the beginning with the 20 files and 20 files at the end of it, right? But you look at in the process. And a lot of that could be, by the way, now automatically generated and checked with the right guardrails. So exactly the same here. So that thing worked already 10 years ago. And then with the DevOps CI/CD introduced in the pharma world in the GXP regulated world. So I think, from my perspective, this is different, but conceptually it's very similar.
Okay. Yeah, okay. It's more with the time.
Right. Sorry.
So you mentioned one of the cases where on a staging environment, AI agent deleted the database. So the question is how, it sounds strange that they even give it permission. So you have to give the privilege and permission to the agent to delete the database. So
No, they did not. That's the problem.
how did it gain the
It
permission?
found the API token with the credentials that was stored on the same place, and he used that token to do that.
So then they thought that they had to mask the credentials and it being masked.
They shouldn't have stored that. First of all, the agent, there were many question marks over there. So first of all, while in the same volume they had the production and the staging. Second, why they stored in the access to the agent that thing with that API token, because agent found this way, and a few others. But it's more an architectural question and lack of guardrails and the right architecture with the agent having access to the things he should know.
Because even if you find the credentials, then you need to have this relevant privileges in order to use those credentials and run the API calls. So
this was the API token that actually grew, so but he was able to apply the API token. Yes, that's right.
yeah, so it still sounds strange because even if you find the relevant credentials, you shouldn't have the permission to run the APIs with those credentials. So
No.
because in our company, for example, we're from Flutter. We have implemented like AI agents, so it has sort of like analytical purposes. Stakeholders can, let's say, text out to Slack and they get analytical answers on commercial and IT-related stuff. So we haven't implemented those kind of guardrails, so it's impossible to come to delete the database. But also it even has some restrictions of how volatile and how free can it be to our queries. So